In this video, I'm going to teach you how to create a sketch to plan additions to a Revit rendering. I'm going to teach you what elements should be included in all renderings. We're going to review the laws of perspective and the elements that make a great rendering, and review the elements of a good composition, and learn how to make a sketch presentation unique. So what you're looking at right now is actually a Revit rendering that shows all of the elements that come kind of, as we say, right out of the box with Revit. This is kind of all the generic families that are within Revit that are good looking, but don't necessarily have the unique personality of the design's intent or the designer's intent. And so what I did was I actually took this to a copy place and had them print out this image for me in color on top of a piece of 8.5 by 11 cardstock, so that I could then take a look at it and decide what elements needed to be added, so that I would know in Enscape how to best use my time. And so let's go ahead and take a look at that. What you're seeing here is that printed out rendering on 8.5 by 11 cardstock. And you can see I've got a bunch of white space below here that I have used for notes. But before we jump in to all of the notes, what I want to do is just talk through a little bit about what I used to create this. I had a printout, and then I also had a black fine tip Sharpie pen and a white colored pencil. So prior to me sketching over this, in my mind, I wanted to make sure that I included the elements that need to be included in all renderings. And so regardless of how I create a rendering, I always make sure that I have a few scale figures if the size of the space allows, at the very least one, but I try to have a few. A view out the window or a background. And I also like to add in any kind of entourage, whether it's little knickknacks on tables or plants. I try not to do too much, because this can affect the size of the drawing very quickly. But I always try to add a few elements that just make the space feel lived in and give an indication of the decoration or decor that will be included. And then, of course, I also want to make sure that my finishes and my lighting selections are unique. And so that's what always needs to be included in a rendering. So as I look at that very generic Revit rendering that I just showed you, I'm starting to think about all of those elements that need to be brought into this rendering. So what I have to do next is think about and review the laws of perspective first before I add those elements in. And so I'm going to introduce those to you right now, or remind you of them right now. Before I can sketch over anything, I have to make sure that things are drawn correctly to scale and are drawn in perspective, because if I scribble too much, or I don't think about all of the good techniques that I've learned so far, then this sketch ceases to be as useful as it could be. So what I've done first is I have connected kind of imaginary lines here for the walls and ceiling, or floor and ceiling line of both of these walls, to try to figure out where the vanishing point on the left and right side are of this rendering. And then you can see I've drawn, it's not super straight because it's just a sketch, but I've drawn this horizon line across here and this dashed line here. And that's a really important element of perspective, right? That horizon line and those vanishing points. They're going to start to help me get all of these other components that I'm sketching into this perspective located correctly, drawn correctly, and scaled correctly, so that the sketch is actually useful for composition. The other thing that I have included, in addition to the vanishing point and the horizon line, is you can see here I have added textures in here to indicate the things that I'm going to add. So I want to, of course, add these scale figures here, which I've brought in. And you can see here, I've got one sitting, one on the left and a couple on the right, in order to provide balance. But you can see here, the next thing I've done is added this texture to it. So I'm not just scribbling to indicate that I want a new ceiling treatment, a new wall finish, and a new flooring finish added in. I'm actually indicating this with texture that I've learned in previous courses. So you can see I've got my stippling that starts a little bit more dense in the corner and fades out. I have my parallel lines that come in here that are a little bit heavy at the edges to give it an indication of line weight. And you can see here, I've even got some parallel lines here and a little bit of cross hatching to indicate this rug. So again, those textures are added in with care and purpose and attention to good sketching techniques of adding texture. Again, the stippling, cross hatching, and parallel lines. The next thing that you can see that reflects good graphics and good rendering skills and reflects the laws of perspective is this idea of shade and shadow. Now, here in this perspective, you can see that there's some dark elements and some light elements. And so it got a little difficult for me to just use a black pen because, for example, the black lines over here on this black chair got a little bit hard to read. The shoulder of this scale figure, when I first drew it in black over the dark trim of this window, was really hard to see. And so I added in with my white pencil some highlights as well. Now, it's not necessarily accurate as far as showing where or reflecting where a light source would be, although it is in parts, but I'm actually really using it to start to pull out some of the lines that would otherwise be obscured with a dark pen on a dark background. So you can see I'm adding in those shadow and highlights in addition to the textures and the vanishing point and horizon line to make this perspective easier to read and to understand. And also, as I said, to reflect the principles of good composition. And so you can see here as we look at this composition as a whole, we've got elements in the foreground, in the midground, and the background. We have some balance with the scale figures, right? We've got one on the left, two on the right, one engaging with this furniture arrangement. I've got a nice focal point back here right in front of that true height line that's going to kind of draw my viewer in and give their eyes something to rest on. And you can see I've also started to indicate the more unique elements that aren't available to my liking in Revit right out of the box, and that I'm going to need to start to bring into Enscape, which is more unique artwork, more unique sconces, and again, side tables, and then a rug over here. Now, finally, I'd like to call your attention to this very simple keynoting strategy that I've used here. You can see that throughout this rendering, there's little annotation bubbles or annotation circles, what we see here with a number inside. And I opted to do this method because I didn't want a bunch of text obscuring the rendering if I were to notate directly on this. I didn't have, because of the way that this was printed out, I didn't have the margin over here that I could start to pull out a leader line over here like we've seen in the past that come over here and start to bring in elements and notes in a column along the side. It was just not possible for me at the copy place that printed this out for me. So I didn't have the ability to pull elements over. I could have pulled elements perhaps down over here, but instead, as I said, I chose this very, very simple annotation strategy here. So you can see everywhere that I want to communicate something to the viewer, I've put a number inside a bubble that correlates down to these keynotes over here. And it's not as distracting as notes would be were they applied directly to this image, but I still have a lot of information here. Now, why does this drawing need to be annotated, you might be asking? Why do I need to annotate a sketch like this? Well, there's two main reasons. The first is because as a designer, you have ideas coming in very quickly, and so you need to make sure to get them written down so that they're not in your head, so that you don't forget anything. And it's really important because you don't want to forget anything as you're presenting this to your viewer. Now, imagine that you had printed out this Revit rendering, the original one that I showed you that didn't have any of the sketches on top, and you wanted to present to your manager some ideas to make this presentation drawing even better. And so since it takes a little bit of time to start adding these extra elements in, it's helpful to show your manager a sketch like this that says, this is what I think we should add. do we have time? Do we have money in the budget to continue to work on this? These are the ideas, if I have time, that I'd like to add to it. Now, you may not be able to sit with your manager in a meeting and talk through every single thing that you want to add, but you may just have to put something like this sketch with these notes in their mailbox or on their desk, or hand it to them as they're running out the door to a client meeting, so that they can look at it at their leisure and give you feedback. So in this case, this annotation strategy and sketch works really well because it allows you to communicate asynchronously with your manager about your ideas. Because there's notes down here and white space, your manager could certainly add red lines, add more details, add more notations about, for example, thoughts that they have on these elements here, that then they could hand back to you and put in your box, and then you would be able to have a record of what changes you needed to make. And then finally, the reason why it's important to notate in this way is, let's say that the process of revising this rendering got interrupted. Maybe you as the designer had to go to a client meeting or be pulled onto another project, or maybe had to call in sick for a couple of days. And this project needed to be finished by another designer. Now that there's a record of what needs to be added, now anyone can start to engage in this workload with you and help you complete this rendering. And so in that way, it's important to have something that is clear and conveys the information. And what's nice about this is that once you've brought in kind of this technique where you've printed out a really nice quality image, you have added additions to it, you've brought in critical elements of any good rendering, like scale figures, a background, entourage, really simple indications of texture and notations, shade and shadow, and you've created this unique composition. Now, this is no longer just a scribbly sketch that's a little bit messy. This is a unique component to look at and starts to document in an artistic and accurate way the development of the design process. And so in this way, it really becomes a more unique presentation that's elevated beyond just a sketch.